In the heart of Nigeria, a loyal servant turned against his own king. He poisoned the throne, betrayed his people, and stole the crown for himself. But what happened next will shock you. Before we begin this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a big thumbs up. The kingdom of Edenla shimmered beneath the golden African sun, its palace roofs glistening like a crown of fire against the bright blue sky. The air smelled of warm dust and blossoming hibiscus flowers, and laughter often echoed from the market square where farmers and traders celebrated another bountiful season. At the center of it all stood King Oba Juwan, a ruler known not for his power, but for his mercy. He had built his throne not on fear, but on faith. Faith in his people, faith in his daughter, and faith in justice. Every afternoon, he would walk through the palace courtyards in his white flowing robe, smiling as he spoke with guards, cooks, and even stable boys. To him, everyone in Edenla mattered. Beside him, often walking with the same grace and kindness, was his only child, Princess Naya. Her laughter carried through the palace halls like sunlight itself, and even the old servants said that when Naya smiled, the birds paused their songs just to listen. But among those who bowed before her, one man's heart was quietly burning with something darker. Tariq, a servant raised in the palace since childhood. Tariq was a man of quiet obedience, with eyes that had once been full of gratitude. Years ago, the king had found him wandering the dusty outskirts of the kingdom, a starving orphan with nothing but hope in his eyes. The king took him in, gave him food, gave him a bed, and trained him as a palace attendant. For years, Tariq worked faithfully, never questioning the king's commands. But time has a strange way of changing hearts. As Princess Naya grew older, her kindness made her beloved by all. The guards respected her, the villagers adored her, and even the elders blessed her name. Tariq, who once felt seen and valued, began to feel invisible again. Whenever the king praised Naya in public, Tariq's chest tightened. Whenever the people shouted her name, his pride shrank like a candle in the wind. He began to whisper to himself that he had served the king for years, yet remained nothing more than a servant, while the young princess, barely half his age, was worshipped like a goddess. The more he thought about it, the heavier the bitterness grew inside him, like a stone pressing against his ribs. One bright afternoon, as the sun washed over the palace marble floors, Tariq stood in the servants' courtyard, scrubbing silver plates. His hands moved out of habit, but his mind was far away, lost in thoughts of what life might be like if he, not Naya, held the power. He imagined himself sitting upon the golden throne, wearing the king's robe, speaking to the people from the balcony where the sun always kissed the crown. The thought made his heart race. And then, almost like a whisper carried by the warm breeze, another thought entered his mind. Why not you, Tariq? Why must you always serve while others rule? He froze. The idea was absurd, yet strangely sweet. That same evening, he watched from a distance as the king and Princess Naya shared laughter with the ministers in the royal garden. The light danced on their faces, and their bond looked unbreakable. But to Tariq, the scene felt like a cruel reminder of his own insignificance. He clenched his fists until his palms ached. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. The golden sunlight that bathed the king and his daughter no longer looked beautiful to him. It looked mocking. It shined on everyone but him. Over the next few days, the darkness inside Tariq grew stronger. He began to notice small things. How the king coughed more than usual, how the royal physician looked worried, how the ministers whispered when they thought no one was listening. The king's health was fading. To most, it was a tragedy, but to Tariq it felt like an opening door. As the days went on, he started planting small seeds of doubt around the palace, soft-spoken lies disguised as concern. I heard the king's illness came from a curse, he told one maid. And the curse passes through blood, he whispered to a guard. It might fall upon the princess next. The rumors spread like fire through dry grass, reaching the markets and villages within days. By the time the king grew too weak to leave his chamber, half the kingdom was already whispering that Princess Naya carried misfortune in her veins. Tariq never raised his voice. He didn't need to. lies once born walk on their own. But even as he plotted, a part of Tariq still remembered the days when King Oba smiled at him like a son. Sometimes, late in the bright afternoons, when the palace halls were empty and only the sound of distant drums floated in the air, Tariq found himself standing before the great mirror in the servants' quarters. He would stare at his own reflection and whisper, "You deserve more." Yet, behind those words, a quiet voice always answered, "The king trusted you." He would shut his eyes, trying to drown that voice, but it always returned, a ghost of the kindness he was trying to forget. And so began the battle that no one saw, the war inside a man who had everything he needed, but wanted more. The sun outside remained bright, the garden still bloomed, and laughter still echoed through Edenla's golden walls. But inside one servant's heart, a storm had begun to rise, one that would soon change the fate of the entire kingdom. The storm inside Tariq's heart grew stronger with every golden afternoon that passed. The king's laughter, once a sound that filled him with comfort, now pierced his ears like a cruel reminder of everything he could never be. Yet, on the outside, he remained the same gentle servant, obedient, respectful, silent. He carried water for the princess, bowed before the ministers, and fetched scrolls for the king's council. No one suspected that behind his calm eyes, plans were forming like cracks under the surface of glass. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the open arches of the royal kitchen, Tariq stood near the herbal jars, pretending to arrange them. His eyes scanned the shelves until he found what he needed, a small clay container marked with a faded red line. The court healer had once said it was used for controlling fevers, but in larger amounts it could still the heart within minutes. Tariq lifted the jar gently, his reflection trembling in the polished brass plates beside it. He didn't need much, just a pinch mixed into the king's honeyed tea. It would look natural, merciful even. The old man was suffering. His end would seem peaceful. Tariq stood there for a long time, the sound of drums echoing faintly from the courtyard. His fingers shook, but his face remained calm. When he finally set the jar back down, a faint smile touched his lips. The decision had been made. That evening, the palace glowed under the warm sunlight. The courtyards were alive with color, children of servants chasing each other through corridors, guards polishing their spears, and the soft hum of women singing as they prepared the royal meal. Princess Naya was with her father, reading poetry beside his bed. The king looked weaker, but his eyes still carried that same kindness that had built an empire. When Tariq entered with the tea, he bowed deeply, keeping his face lowered. The sweet aroma filled the chamber as he poured it into the golden cup. The king smiled faintly. "Ah, Tariq," he said softly, his voice gentle but tired. "You have always been loyal." Those words hit Tariq harder than any sword ever could. For a moment, his chest ached with guilt. He hesitated, the cup trembling slightly in his hands. But then his gaze shifted to Princess Naya, her elegant posture, her effortless grace, her hand resting on her father's arm like the rightful heir she was born to be. That same sharp pain of envy returned, burning away his hesitation. He handed the cup over and stepped back silently. The king drank slowly, sighing as if comforted. Outside, the sun slipped behind the clouds for just a moment, a brief shadow passing over the land, before light returned again. The next day, the kingdom woke to morning. Bells rang across Edenla, echoing over the golden fields. King Oba was gone. People gathered outside the palace gates, their faces streaked with tears, as the ministers announced his passing. Tariq stood among them, head bowed, every inch of him performing grief so convincingly that even Princess Naya placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You were like a son to him," she whispered. The words cut through him like a blade. He wanted to scream, to confess, to tear away the mask. But instead, he lowered his head and said softly, "He was my king." The days that followed blurred into endless rituals and ceremonies. The palace smelled of incense and grief. But beneath the sorrow, something darker was spreading. The rumors Tariq had planted now took deeper root. Some ministers began to whisper that the king's death had come too suddenly. Others remembered the curse stories. When Naya tried to speak to the council about her father's final wishes, they exchanged uneasy glances. Her voice, once full of authority, now sounded like an echo in an empty hall. And all the while, Tariq moved silently through the palace, whispering comfort to some, spreading doubt to others, until slowly, the tide began to turn in his favor. By the time the sun returned to full strength above Edenla's sky, the palace no longer looked the same. The white flags of mourning had been replaced by banners of crimson and gold, colors chosen not by tradition, but by decree. Tariq stood at the steps of the throne room, the afternoon light shining behind him like a halo. Ministers stood on either side, unsure, their loyalty hanging in the balance. He spoke softly, but his words carried the weight of command. "The princess must rest," he said. "The kingdom needs guidance until she is ready." The late king would not want chaos. His tone was calm, his face unreadable, his voice like honey masking the taste of poison. The council nodded, uncertain but afraid to disagree. Princess Naya stood at the far end of the hall, her face pale but proud. She looked at Tariq, the servant her father had loved like family, and saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. It wasn't grief. It was triumph. When the ministers bowed before him, she turned away, her tears hidden in the folds of her royal scarf. And as Tariq climbed the throne steps, the same sunlight that once belonged to the true king now glowed behind a man who had forgotten what loyalty meant. The people outside cheered his name not because they loved him, but because fear had begun its rule. The days that followed Tariq's rise to power were bathed in deceptive light. From the outside, the kingdom of Edenla looked brighter than ever. Banners fluttered across the palace towers, the fountains flowed with scented water, and drums echoed through the courtyards to celebrate what the ministers called a new dawn. But beneath the music and the fragrance of fresh flowers, silence lived in the hearts of the people. They had seen kindness die and fear take its place. Every smile now looked rehearsed. Every bow felt heavy. Princess Naya was confined to her chambers, her voice stripped from the council, her royal duties suspended under the pretext of grief. Servants who once adored her now avoided her eyes, afraid of being accused of disloyalty. Tariq had turned her world into a golden cage, one built not of metal, but of whispers. At night, the once lively palace corridors became graveyards of sound. The guards changed their shifts like shadows, and the sound of laughter had disappeared entirely. Even the birds that used to nest along the palace arches had flown away. And in the grand throne room, Tariq sat upon the golden seat meant for kings, his hand resting on the armrest that once carried the seal of justice. But ruling a kingdom, Tariq soon learned, was far lonelier than dreaming of one. The first few days felt intoxicating. Ministers bowed lower, servants spoke softer, and every decision he made was met with nods instead of questions. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the weight of the crown began to suffocate him. The people were growing restless. Crops were failing from neglect. Taxes had increased to fund endless palace celebrations, and the streets outside the golden gates had lost their music. Tariq's reflection in the polished mirrors of the royal court no longer looked like the humble servant he once was. It looked like a man haunted by his own victory. He began to sleep less, eat less, and trust no one. Every servant's whisper sounded like betrayal. Every bow felt too slow, too deliberate. He started replacing guards every few days, convinced that everyone around him was plotting his fall. The ministers, once obedient, now looked at him with veiled contempt. But what frightened Tariq most was not the ministers or the guards. It was the quiet resilience of Princess Naya. Despite her confinement, Naya never pleaded, never broke. She spent her days sitting by the window, her eyes gazing over the gardens where she used to walk with her father. The servants who dared bring her food said she always thanked them with the same gentle voice, as if nothing had changed. To the people outside, her silence looked like weakness. To Tariq, it felt like power, the kind of power he couldn't control. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the palace walls glowed in soft amber light, Tariq walked to Naya's chamber. He stood at the door, listening. Inside, he could hear her praying, her words soft, but steady. She prayed not for her freedom, but for Edenla, for the same people who had turned against her. Something inside Tarek twisted. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint sting of shame. But before it could bloom into guilt, anger swallowed it whole. He opened the door without knocking. Naya looked up, calm but unafraid. "You've come to see what mercy looks like," she said quietly. "The same mercy my father showed you." Her words were like a blade wrapped in silk. Tarek's jaw tightened. "Your father was weak," he replied coldly. "Mercy makes rulers blind." Naya shook her head slowly, her voice unwavering. "No, Tarek. Mercy makes them human." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of the evening wind brushing through the curtains. Tarek wanted to shout, to remind her who wore the crown now, but the truth in her eyes held him still. He turned and left without another word, yet her voice lingered in his mind long after the door closed. The next morning, a storm rolled over Edenla. Dark clouds gathered above the palace, and thunder roared across the fields like the voice of an old god. In the market, people whispered that the heavens were mourning their true king. Inside the palace, Tarek sat on the throne, his face pale under the dim glow of the torches. Ministers stood before him, arguing over taxes, food, and trade, but their words sounded distant, like echoes in a dream. His thoughts kept drifting back to Naya's calm face and her quiet defiance. That evening, unable to bear the weight of his thoughts, Tarek walked alone through the palace gardens. The air smelled of wet earth and hibiscus. He stopped near the pond where the king once fed the koi fish. The water, once clear, was now clouded with fallen leaves. For the first time, he saw his reflection not as a ruler, but as a man consumed by what he had once envied. He had everything he had ever wanted, and yet, it felt like standing in the middle of a desert with no water to drink. His hands trembled as he whispered to himself, "I did it for the kingdom," but deep down he knew he had done it for himself. As lightning flashed in the sky, Tarek turned and saw the ghost of his past standing in the rain. A memory of himself as a young boy, barefoot and grateful, looking up at the king who had saved him. The image vanished in an instant, but the guilt stayed. He walked back inside, drenched, and called for his guards. "Keep the princess under watch," he ordered. "No one enters her chamber without my command." The guards nodded, unaware that their new king was fighting a war inside his mind. That night, sleep finally came to Tarek, but it was filled with visions. He saw King Obajuwan standing before him, holding a golden crown in one hand and a handful of dust in the other. "You chose wrong, my son," the old king's voice echoed. "You wore the gold and forgot the earth." When Tarek woke, sweat poured down his face, and the morning light felt too bright, too harsh. The storm outside had passed, but another had just begun. One that would soon pull him, Princess Naya, and the entire kingdom into a reckoning no one could escape. The morning after the storm, the kingdom of Edenla looked strangely quiet, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from fear. The streets outside the palace were empty, puddles reflecting the broken sunlight, and the scent of rain hung in the air like an unfinished prayer. Inside the palace walls, Tarek sat at the head of the royal table, surrounded by ministers whose faces carried more caution than loyalty. The feast laid before them was untouched. Roasted goat, honeyed bread, and golden plantains, glistening under torchlight. But no one dared to eat. Rumors had spread that the new king did not share meals without reason, and the fear of poison now lingered over every bite. Tarek's eyes scanned the room slowly, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair. He was thinner than before, his face sharp, his eyes restless. The crown, the same one that had once rested on King Obajuwan's kind brow, looked heavy on him, as though it was never meant to stay. "Edenla must remain strong," he said at last, his voice carrying through the hollow hall. "The people have grown weak with doubt. They whisper that the gods are angry." One of the elders bowed deeply. "Perhaps, my king," he said carefully, "the gods are not angry with the people, but with us." The words hung in the air like smoke. Tarek's jaw tightened. For a moment, The elder's courage seemed to impress him. But then, without warning, Tariq stood. "Leave," he commanded. His voice echoed off the marble walls, sharp and final. One by one, the ministers bowed and left, their robes trailing behind them. When the hall was empty, Tariq sank back into his chair and stared at the untouched feast before him. His reflection rippled in the wine cup, distorted by trembling hands. The food smelled of wealth, but to him, it tasted like ashes. That night, the palace corridors felt colder than usual. The torches flickered, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Tariq wandered aimlessly, his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. Every corner of the palace carried memories. His laughter as a boy, the king's voice teaching him discipline, the princess's soft words of kindness. Now those memories haunted him like ghosts. He walked past the old throne room, where the golden curtains swayed gently in the night wind. For a moment, he could almost see the late King Obajuwan seated there again. His calm smile, his steady hands. "You have lost the throne of your soul," the memory whispered. Tariq turned away sharply, his breath quickening. He walked until he reached the locked door of Princess Naya's chamber. For days, he had avoided her, afraid of her calmness, her quiet strength. But tonight, something inside him pushed him closer. He ordered the guards to unlock the door. Inside, Naya sat by the window, her white gown glowing softly in the moonlight. She turned her head slowly, her eyes steady. "You cannot sleep," she said simply. Tariq hesitated, caught off guard. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because guilt has a sound," she replied. "It walks before a man even when his footsteps are silent." Her words hit him like a wave. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but the truth in her tone was undeniable. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Your father's mercy made this kingdom weak." Naya stood, her voice calm but firm. "No, Tariq, my father's mercy made it whole. It was your envy that broke it." The silence that followed felt endless. The flickering torchlight painted shadows across their faces, one burning with regret, the other glowing with quiet defiance. "You think you can still save Edenla?" he asked bitterly. "No," she said, stepping closer. "I think you can, if you remember who you were before power made you forget." Her words echoed long after he left the room. That night, Tariq didn't return to his royal chamber. Instead, he walked to the temple at the edge of the palace gardens, a place he hadn't visited since his coronation. The air there was heavy with the scent of incense and old prayers. The golden statue of the sun god stood tall at the altar, its surface glimmering faintly under the moonlight. Tariq knelt, his knees pressing into the cold stone. For the first time in years, he spoke not as a king, but as a man. "If I've wronged the path, show me how to return," he whispered. His voice cracked in the quiet. Outside, the night wind rustled through the hibiscus trees, carrying the faint sound of distant drums. Not of celebration, but of unrest. Beyond the palace gates, the people were beginning to gather, their patience worn thin. Farmers had abandoned the fields. Traders refused to bring goods to the capital. The kingdom that had once thrived on love and fairness was now drowning in fear. Tariq rose from the altar, his heart pounding. He knew then what he had to do, but redemption, he also knew, never came without consequence. The next morning, before the first light touched the palace, Tariq called for the guards. "Release the princess," he ordered. The guards looked at one another in disbelief, but no one dared to question him. When Naya stepped into the courtyard, her white gown fluttered in the dawn breeze. The sun rose slowly behind her, casting a halo of gold around her silhouette. Tariq stood waiting, no longer wearing the crown, no longer hiding behind his pride. "You were right," he said quietly. "Mercy makes us human." Naya looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and understanding. "Then be human again," she said. As the morning light spread across the marble floors, Tariq turned toward the people gathering outside the palace gates. The drums had stopped. All eyes were on him, the servant who became king, and the king who had lost himself. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice trembling but true. "I took this throne through deceit," he said, the words carrying over the hushed crowd. "I brought fear where there was once peace. Today, I return Edenla to its rightful heir." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Naya stepped forward, her face calm yet shining with emotion. Tarek placed the golden crown at her feet and bowed deeply, lower than he ever had in his life. For a long moment the world seemed to stand still. The sunlight poured over the courtyard, bathing them both in its warmth. Naya gently lifted the crown but did not place it on her head. Instead, she said softly, "No kingdom stands on vengeance, only on forgiveness." She turned to the crowd and declared, "Edenla will rise again, not through power, but through peace." The people bowed, tears glistening in their eyes. Tarek, still kneeling, felt a strange peace wash over him, the kind he had been chasing all along. The same golden light that once mocked him now felt forgiving. As the drums began to sound again, this time in celebration, Tarek rose to his feet and stepped back, fading into the crowd. He had once believed power could define a man. Now he understood that surrender could too. And though the story of Edenla would remember Princess Naya as the Queen of Light, somewhere in its quieter pages, it would also speak of a man who fell into darkness and found his way back through mercy. The morning sun rose higher than it had in years, spilling golden light across the newly reborn kingdom of Edenla. The palace that once echoed with whispers of deceit now hummed with the sound of rebuilding. Hammers striking, voices calling, laughter returning to the courtyards. The banners of crimson and gold that once symbolized control were replaced with the soft white and emerald colors of peace. Children played again in the gardens, their laughter carrying through the same marble corridors where fear had once walked. Queen Naya stood on the grand balcony, her gown flowing like silk woven from morning light. The crown rested lightly upon her head, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a promise. Beside her stood the ministers, the guards, and the commoners she had invited to stand within the palace walls. "Edenla belongs to all of us," she declared, her voice steady and filled with warmth. "No man or woman shall kneel in fear again. We will not build our future with swords, but with open hands." Her words rolled through the air like the sound of a new beginning. The people bowed their heads, not because they were commanded to, but because they wanted to. The wind carried her voice over the golden fields, through the streets, into the hearts of every farmer and merchant who had once doubted hope. For the first time since her father's death, the kingdom truly felt alive again. But even as peace began to bloom, Naya could not shake one lingering question. What had become of Tarek? No one had seen him since the day he knelt before her and returned the crown. Some said he had fled the palace in shame. Others whispered that he had vanished into the forest where the river meets the sun. But Naya believed something deeper, that he had gone to seek the forgiveness of the gods. Late at night, when the moonlight touched her window and the world was quiet, she often thought of the boy her father had once saved, the servant who had lost his way, and the man who had found redemption too late. Her heart did not carry hatred for him, only a quiet sorrow and a strange gratitude. For in his downfall, he had reminded her what kind of queen she was meant to be. One afternoon, while visiting the outer villages, Naya saw something that stopped her heart. A small group of children playing near the river, led by a man with a familiar presence. He wore simple clothes, his beard rough, his back straight. When the children laughed, his smile appeared, tired but peaceful. It was Tarek. He was alive. Naya did not call out to him. She simply watched. Their eyes met briefly across the sunlight, her gaze full of compassion, his full of relief. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Forgiveness had already happened between them, silent and complete. As she turned to leave, she knew that the story of Edenla had found its balance once more. Seasons passed. Under Queen Naya's rule, Edenla flourished beyond memory. The fields grew richer, the rivers ran clearer, and the festivals of light returned brighter than ever before. Statues of King Obajuwan were cleaned and restored, not to remind people of grief, but of the legacy that mercy leaves behind. Every year, on the day her father had passed, Naya would open the palace gates to everyone. Servants, farmers, traders, and even travelers from neighboring lands. They would gather in the great courtyard, where she would tell them the story of a kingdom that fell into darkness and rose again through forgiveness. She never mentioned names, only spoke of a king of kindness, a servant who lost himself, and a people who chose peace. The crowd always listened in silence, their faces glowing in the firelight. And somewhere among them, unseen in the shadows, a lone man would always watch, the once ambitious servant, now a humble teacher of orphans. He no longer wore the robes of power, but the weight on his soul was gone. When the night ended, he would disappear back into the quiet countryside, leaving behind only the faint sound of a prayer. Years turned into decades, and the tale of Edenla became legend. Travelers told it across distant lands, of how envy tried to destroy a kingdom, but mercy rebuilt it. The palace still shone under the same golden sun, its towers wrapped in vines of jasmine and flame lilies. Queen Naya ruled into her twilight years, her heart still guided by the same compassion that once silenced a storm. When she finally passed, the people mourned not with tears, but with gratitude. They placed her crown beside her father's under the great tree of Edenla, where two doves had built their nest, a symbol that peace had come full circle. Far away, in a quiet village by the river, an old man felt the wind change that morning. He looked up at the sky and smiled softly. "She's home now," he whispered. Tarek closed his eyes, the sunlight warming his wrinkled face. And as the birds soared over the horizon, the kingdom of Edenla shone once more, not through power, not through fear, but through the golden mercy that lives forever in the hearts of those who forgive.